He's the son of Ike Richmond, one of the two men who purchased the Syracuse Nationals, moved them to Philly in 1963, and called the team the 76ers. Dave Richmond, who authored the book Wilt, Ike, and Me, talks all things Wilt Chamberlin, including the urban legend that Wilt slept with 20,000 women.
There would always be sometimes 2, sometimes 5, sometimes more incredibly good-looking ladies dressed to the nines, just there like, hey, if you want it, I'm here.
Dave Richmond, here to discuss Philly's own Wilton Norman Chamberlin and go deep into Sixers history, next on Fresh 24. David Richmond, first and foremost, you are the author of a book on Wilt Chamberlin. It is a wonderful first half account. He was your roommate when you were 16, and I'll give you plenty of chances to explain that one. You're the president and creative director of the publishing company you founded. You're also an advertising consultant. You have a deep interest in the field of meditation. But most of what we're going to talk about is the unique perspective you have on the Philadelphia-born Wilton Norman Chamberlin, still in the opinion of many, the most dominant player in NBA history. David Richmond, welcome to Fresh 24.
Pleasure to be here, Marc. Thanks so much.
First, some background. And, the young people say, well, I don't really care that much about history, but I'm going to urge them here to pay attention because you wouldn't be a fan of the 76ers without what went on before you became a fan, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 8 years ago, whatever. So first, David, the Syracuse Nationals, of course, I know the answer, but why are the Nationals important in the history of the Sixers?
Well, two things. One is it's important to understand, and I don't want to dwell too much on history, that there was a basketball team in Philadelphia prior to the Philadelphia 76ers, and it was called the Philadelphia Warriors. And there was an era in that with that team where Wilt was drafted when he was in 11th grade. My father and Eddie Gottlieb drafted him on the NBA had I think they still have. You can draft somebody who's a local star who's going to be big, and they drafted Wilt when he was in 11th grade. So that was the team for many, many years in Philadelphia. And the year that Wilt scored 100 points was an incredible year. And Marc, I may mention that there's something that very few fans know about. And of all the Wilt Chamberlain statistics that there are, this one is probably the most incredible to me. And that is that in 1962, he played every minute of every game, including the playoffs, with the exception of one 13-minute segment where he had been thrown out by the ref. Other than that, he was on the floor every minute of every game. And don't forget, he was the center of attention. You had 3 or 4 guys double teaming him, triple teaming him. And Marc, they played him dirty. They played him hard. I was sitting in the front row, and it was horrible to watch. So at the end of that year of 62, they Eddie Gottlieb sold the Philadelphia Warriors to a group with a guy named Franklin Muley in San Francisco, and they became the San Francisco Warriors. And for a year, there was no basketball team in Philadelphia. Now, one of the things you have to realize is that the fans of the Warriors hated the Celtics, the Boston Celtics, with a vengeance that you wouldn't believe. But the second most hated team was the Syracuse Nationals. We hated them. And every single person on the team, we booed them. We went crazy. So my father he was an attorney, and he was the attorney for the Warriors. He had done the trade with San Francisco, but he had been negotiating with a guy named Danny Biasone to buy the Syracuse Nationals. And that's what happened. At the end of 62, he bought the Syracuse Nationals and moved them to Philadelphia. He had a partner named Irv Kozloff, and they brought the team down here. And they had a name the team contest because my father was very cognizant of the fact that this was a team of rivals. And somebody came up with the name the 76ers. And my dad picked that name. He thought it was a great name. Personally, I thought it was the worst name I ever heard, but that's another story. But that's who the 76ers were. They were the Nationals. And Dolph Shays, by the way, who was an all-star player, he became very, very close to my father immediately, and they formed a pretty incredible relationship.
So you've opened up a lot of areas of discussion, and one is that one season, 62-63, where the city did not have a professional basketball team, at least in the NBA. What was it like? Were they really missing basketball? Did they have to have a team?
Well, again, you have to understand that I had two eras with Wilt. And that first era, he joined the team in 59 when I was 10. So I was pretty young. And all I knew was what I knew. And we were at the games, we were at every game. And when there was no team, it was like, what? It didn't make any sense. I don't know if the rest of the city, I'm sure it was felt to that degree. I'm sure it wasn't felt to the degree that I was feeling it, but it was pretty incredible to not have anybody. And we thought, my dad figured this was going to be a good thing to do, but it was tough. And two things happened. One is after the second game, this new team, the 76ers, a Friday after the second game, President Kennedy got shot. So my God, they're try to start a new sports team with that as the overall thing that was happening. And then there was very, very, very little attendance. We were playing at a place called Convention Hall, which held close to 10,000 people. And I don't think there was ever a night where we had more than 1,500 people at a game. Maybe once we had 2,000. The press didn't cover it, and the team had no traction in Philadelphia whatsoever. My father used to come up with these things. I was in ninth grade, and he'd say to me, okay, get a couple of your friends, tell them I'll give them tickets to the game, and then afterwards, you got to stay because we're doing free basketball night. You'll give out basketballs, or free date night, bring your date, and you'll get a free hot dog. So many of these things. And guess what? Nobody came. We'd be on the stage at Convention Hall after the game. We'd have like 2,000 basketballs, and I don't know what he did with them, but we didn't give them away. It wasn't until he got Wilt that there was real interest in that team. He got a guy named Luke Jackson in the Olympics in Tokyo in '64. It brought some element of crowd to the games, but there was a dead thing. Wilt came, the first practice, 900 people came to the first practice. And then what happened was they started to play. Wilt, he's playing with a team of rivals. He didn't even know these guys. The Celtics came to town on, I think, the third game, and they blew the Celtics out of the building. And it was like, that was it. The city was in love, and that began the whole thing.
Hey, it's Marc Zumoff. Join me and Philly sports favorite Seth Joyner, Mike Quick, MMA champ Eddie Alvarez, Joe Conklin, Dee Lynam, Matt Cord, Ricky Bowe, and the Cuz, Anthony Gargano. What a lineup. We want you to join us on the Bet Parks team. Bet Parks is the official winning partner of the Philadelphia 76ers and the only casino and sports book that yours truly, Marc Zumoff, recommends and uses. Whether your team scores or not, there's always another way to win on the Bet Parks online casino and sportsbook app. Bet Parks has your seat with a live dealer for all your favorite classic casino games. Right on your phone and wherever you are, the tailgate, the stadium, on your couch. Double down on fourth down. Make downtime fun time. Play live dealer blackjack, craps, roulette, and more while watching the game. Bet on all your favorite sports. Bet the Birds, pro football, and college football. Download the Bet Parks app right now and enjoy all the action and excitement from the casino at your fingertips. Play hundreds of exciting online slots. New users download the BetParks online casino app and sportsbook and get up to $1,000 casino bonus back if you're down in the first 24 hours. Casino bonus must be wagered. See betparks.com for details. Must be 21 and in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or Michigan. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. You play for fun. You love to win. You bet. BetParks.
David, the average NBA franchise is worth a reported $4.5 billion. So the Nationals were purchased for between 5 and 600,000. Did 5 to 600,000 feel anything like $4.5 billion back in the day?
I'll tell you what happened to give you a little perspective. I think, from what I understood, and again, don't forget, I was a kid, and it wasn't like my father was consulting me or telling me anything. And by the way, he was the founder and general partner of a very powerful law firm called Richmond, Price and Jamison in town. So the Sixers were a sideline for him. Law was his game. But he went to make this deal. From what I heard, it was 700, and he only had 350, and he needed 350, and he was going around trying to get partners. And he had a cousin who he's very close with, named Mel, who had an advertising agency, Mel Richmond Advertising in Bala Cynwyd. And according to the story, my father went to him to see if he wanted to come in on it. And Mel said, "Ike, professional sports has peaked. The next thing you know, you guys are going to be charging $5 to a game. Who the hell is going to come? Who's going to pay $5 to see a basketball game? Are you kidding? I'm out." And the only guy that he could get into it was Irv Kozlov, who was his childhood friend from elementary school. Koz was doing great with a paper company that he founded. And he said to my father, finally, my father just fucked his ear off. And according to the story that Koz told me, Koz said, "Look, I'll give you the money, but I don't have time. My company's exploding, all kinds of stuff's happening. I'm not going to be able to pay much attention to this, but I'll give you the money." And that was it. And the idea, and another thing, Mark, that very few people know, but if you're my age, you know this well, all the pro athletes of the day, basketball, baseball, football, they played their sport. And then guess what? In the off season, they had a job. They went to haberdashery and stood in the store. They went to a car place and sat and signed autographs. Because they didn't get any kind of money that they had to work for it. It was just a job. Everything was way, way, way different. Totally different. And these guys, by the way, all knew each other on a first name basis. And Gottlieb, when these guys started, and we don't have time for this, but this is an interesting story. They started trying to make professional basketball, and they would have a league here, they'd have a league there, it would collapse, things would happen. Finally, they got together and said, "Let's really try to do this." And I think it was 5 or 6 of them. And Gottlieb and another one said, "All right, well, let's give it a big name. Let's call it National Basketball Association." And they almost started laughing because you look at the teams, the Fort Wayne Pistons, the St. Louis Hawks. All you had, New York, Philly, and Boston were the only big cities. The rest of them, the Rochester Royals. Come
on. So to your point, 63-64, this new team, the 76ers, they have the 6th best record in the NBA, but there were only 9 NBA teams at that point. They had a playoff series. They lost to a very good Cincinnati Royals team with, among others, Oscar Robertson. The Royals, by the way, became the Sacramento Kings, but I digress. The next year, the Sixers are pretty much a 500 team, and as you alluded to, and I'll be specific here, in January of that season, the Sixers bring Wilt Chamberlin back to Philly in a trade with San Francisco. How big of a deal was it? Because as you had mentioned, the team had barely, the fans had barely taken notice of this new NBA team to this point.
You have to understand that Wilt was the pride of the city when the Warriors were here, and he just was so dominant and such an incredible factor to watch. I have scrapbooks from those days There was one night they got beat. The Celtics beat them one night. They had an off night. It was the Philadelphia Bulletin that goes, Celt shocked, Warriors lose. Wilt held to 37. And it was like, and if he didn't score 50 points, he had an off night. He was unbelievable. And plus, he just, we don't have time to go into what he was really like as a person, but I will tell you this. And again, I was a kid and everything, but he was the coolest guy you've ever seen in your life. He was so cool and so funny and incredible. And don't forget, at one point in time, he bought a nightclub in Harlem. He bought a very famous place called Small's Paradise, and he renamed it Big Wilt Small's Paradise. And he used to go up there all the time. And the thing that's funny, I don't know if you were going to get to this, but they made the trade. It was a huge deal. Everything was going crazy. I was in 10th grade at Cheltenham High School, and it's 3 weeks after the trade. And I come home, and my mother and our domestic helper are in my room moving my clothes out. And my mother says, "Get on the floor. We have to tie the two beds together." We had twin beds. I said, "Why?" She goes, "Wilt's moving in. Daddy's making him." And it's like, we had to get this thing set up. 2 days later, he moved into the house.
Well, we're going to talk all about that. I mean, clearly that's a large part of what your book is about. But a lot of this was predicated upon the fact that Wilt and Ike Richman, they had quite a special relationship. In fact, didn't he actually represent him for a time?
Yeah, what happened was, and again, I can't verify this, but it was Wilt told me the story personally. They had a thing called the territorial draft. Gottlieb saw the incredible nature of Wilt. In 11th grade, they got him. And they went out and, Gotti and my father drove out to Wilt's house in Cobbs Creek. He's an 11th grader. And according to Wilt, my father said to him, "Now, listen, you're with us now. And, we've got you. And you're going to make a lot of money. And it's going to come fast. And there's going to be a lot of it. And let me tell you, you can lose it faster than you can make it." Now, I'm the attorney for the team. And if you'd like, I'll be your attorney as well, and I'll be your financial advisor as well. And Wilt just held out his hand, and they shook hands, and that was it. And from that time on, my father was really like Wilt's second father.
Wait, let me just interrupt you for a second. That sounds like a conflict of interest.
They didn't
where
have
he's
it.
He's the team attorney and a potential player's attorney.
They didn't have it. And that, like, if it, whatever it was, okay, it was fine with everybody. And now let me tell you something that happened that'll tell you a little bit about their relationship. So it's game 5 of the semis against the Royals. Now this is Wilt's on the team. They're playing. It's incredible. The semis against the Royals. They lost. Both teams lost the home games. It was like a best of 5. So it was they came to Convention Hall, and my father calls me on the phone, and he says, and I was driving Wilt to the games. It's all a long story. My father says to me, "You tell Wilt I need to talk to him before he goes out tonight." I said, "Okay." So I tell Wilt. We get to Convention Hall. The locker rooms were upstairs. My father comes in with his briefcase. The team comes down in their warm-up uniforms. They go through the curtain and go out. My father motions to Wilt. Wilt comes by. My father has 3 contracts out on a table. This is game 5. This is it. Wilt's eyes are on the game. He's there. My father is pointing down the places in the contract, and Wilt just looks down and signs them like 5 or 6 times. Doesn't even know what he's signing. Isn't even paying attention. And then my father nods to him. They open the curtain. Wilt goes out, and we follow him. Can you imagine now? And then they did a documentary on Wilt not that long ago called Goliath. It was on Showtime. And one of Wilt's friends said, he goes, I knew Wilt really well, and I'll tell you something. Wilt didn't trust most people. He said, let me change that. Wilt didn't trust anybody, but Wilt trusted Ike. And that's the way they were. One time, Marc, when Wilt stayed with us, Wilt used to come up upstairs. It was me, Wilt, and my sister at the end of the wing. And Wilt and I used to play cards every night and hang around. Again, he was on the road half the time, but he came up one night and he just said, "You want to hear what kind of guy your father is?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, because they used to go in my father's office every night after dinner. And he goes, "I walked in, your father shows me the piece, a newspaper. There's Mickey Mantle signing baseballs on the front. And your father says to me, 'You know what he's doing, Will? You know why he's signing those baseballs? Because he drank and gambled away all of his money. He was already buying land in Los Angeles for Wilt. He just said, trust me, Wilton, when you're 40, you're not going to be signing basketballs for rent money.'" And Wilt loved him. You know what I mean? It was a big deal. And of course, it was a very special little period of time.
Well, David Richman, we are going to dig in a big way into your book, Wilt, Ike, and Me. You talked about Wilt living in your house. Your father's a part owner of the 76ers. You're a teenager at the time, and we're going to touch more on that in just a moment. But first, it is now halftime. And the first part of our halftime is the Garage Beer 6-pack of questions. It's brought to you by Garage Beer, beer-flavored beer, David. Find some near you at drinkgaragebeer.com. I will give you a choice between two things. You just blurt out the answer. Don't think about it. Just blurt. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Cheesesteak or soft pretzel?
Soft pretzel.
Center City or South Jersey?
South Jersey.
Gritty, the Flyers mascot, or the Philly Fanatic?
Fanatic.
Meek Mill or Hall & Oates? Those are two musical groups. I don't know if you know them or not. How about if I say Frank Sinatra or Perry Como? You better with that?
Hall & Oates and Frank Sinatra.
Okay. Dr. J or Allen Iverson throwback jersey?
Dr. J.
Liberty Bell or Rocky Steps?
Rocky.
The 6-pack of questions brought to you by Garage Beer, beer-flavored beer. Find some near you at drinkgaragebeer.com. I will give you a handful of artists from my music library, and you tell me if you have them or not. Are you ready?
Sure.
The Temptations.
Are you kidding?
No.
Of course I have.
Okay, fine. Miles Davis.
Yes.
Led Zeppelin.
Not really, no.
Okay. Steely Dan.
Absolutely.
Good. Biggie Smalls.
No.
All right. Thank you very much for going through your library. And now I want to go through your book, Wilt, Ike, and Me. Wilt Chamberlain, Philadelphia born and bred, Overbrook High School. He breaks into the NBA with the Warriors. He moves with the Warriors to San Francisco in 62, gets reacquired by the Sixers in January of 65. The grandson of one of the Sixers owners, or I should say the son of one of the Sixers owners, David Richman, gets profoundly affected by Wilt's return, hence the title of the book, Wilt, Ike, and Me. David, how exactly does Wilt end up having to live at your house? Couldn't they get him an apartment or something like that?
Tell you a funny story. As I mentioned, Wilt had a nightclub in New York. Wilt was an amazing basketball player. He was an amazing athlete. But you have to understand a couple of things about him. One is, wherever he went, he was the most amazing thing anyone had ever seen. And anybody who had ever been with him personally or spoken to him remembers it for the rest of their life, okay? It was a very, very big deal. So he had this nightclub in Harlem. And when he bought it, it was open like a certain amount of hours. He made it 24/7. And New York was his town. Philly was way too small for him. And the thing is that my father, when he traded for Wilt, my father had they were like the team doctor was a close friend, the accountant was a close friend. So Stan Lorber was the team doctor. He had Stan take a look at Wilt, and Wilt said to my father, he may have some pancreatic issues. You better watch him a little bit. So my father told him, you're moving in with us. And he didn't want him partying. And, they had spent a lot of money on this, and it was a whole big deal, and all this stuff was happening. And Wilt, they had a team now. This team of nobodies with this stranger suddenly challenged, and I mean heavily, heavily challenged the Celtics in the finals of that year down to the very last second of the last game. And every game was won by like this much for most of them. So this was a major thing. And my father didn't want him to be going to New York. And Wilt had a driver who would take him to New York. And after my father died, that driver came. There was a big thing at the house after he died for a week and everything. And the driver came to the house and told me and my brother, he said, you know, I'll tell you now, I can tell you something. Wilt used to pay me to drive him to New York. Your father paid me not to drive him. So I'd come up with these excuses. Oh, my mother needs me or whatever. But that was basically it. And they had an agreement. And, you know, Wilt had plenty of time to do whatever he wanted to do. My father really wanted him close. And Wilt didn't mind it. And Wilt told us he was a renowned insomniac. But he mentioned to me that he never slept better than the nights that he spent sleeping in my old bedroom. I had the guest room. So
there's an excerpt there's an excerpt from your book where Wilt takes you out for a parallel parking lesson of all things. Please tell us in your own words how that turned out.
Well, this is a great story because it really shows you what it was like. Okay. I had gotten my permit. I was trying to get my license. Okay. And I was really having trouble parallel parking. I could do everything else. And Wilt, see, the thing about Wilt that was funny is he used to kill time in the afternoon. He had nothing to do. He'd wake up, he'd either have lunch with somebody or whatever, but he'd be around a lot until it was game time. Now, if they were on the road, he wasn't with us. So one day he says, you know, we're talking and I'm telling him about parallel parking. He goes, look, it's not that hard. Come on, you'll drive. Let's go. We get in the car. We start driving. And I go into it in a little bit of detail. So you'll see he used to sit in the back of the car. He wouldn't sit in the front of the car. And if I had him, I'd be driving my father's Cadillac. Most of the time I wasn't. He would sit in the back of the Cadillac. Somehow he'd be over the front seat. So you'd feel like he was in the front seat. And then he goes, oh, you're good enough now. Let's listen to some music. And I turn the radio on. I turn it on. It's Sam Cooke, Another Saturday Night. And he's like, oh, that's my theme song. Turn it up. And I got to turn it up loud. He's snapping his fingers. You know, I'm sick. I don't even have my license. I barely know what I'm doing. He's snapping his fingers like right next to my ear. And I'm like, oh, my God. Well, you know, I'm trying to concentrate. And as I mentioned in the book, it was annoying, but in a certain regard, it was like the coolest thing in the world because he really was the coolest guy in the world. So we get, for those people that are listening that know the old days, there was a place called Broad and Olney that was it's still there, but it was a really high-end shopping area in those days. And we're driving along. It's like a Tuesday afternoon at 4 or something like that. And he goes, oh, there's this. Okay. He goes, okay, pull over there. There's a spot. He goes, all right, now come on, let me see what you can do. I'm mad, I can't do it. And then I'm focused, and he just goes, all right, look, it's not that hard. Now I'm going to get out. Just do what I tell you to do. And he's standing there, and he's going, cut the wheel. And he's like smacks on the car. No, cut the wheel. And so I'm looking, and I look over, and all of a sudden I look over, and there's a crowd, must have been 50 kids surrounding him, and they're all going, Wilt. And it just came out of nowhere, and there's a throng around him. I wrote like they were like iron filings stuck on a magnet. And one of the kids throws out a basketball to him, and he catches it with his right hand. And just intuitively, he just stood up full height and held the ball. It must have been 9. When he had the ball in his hand overhead, it must have been 9 feet in the air, and they're all like in awe, And then somebody goes, Wilt, sign this. And he looks at his watch, which he didn't even have a watch. And he goes, no, kids, I gotta go. And he comes back over, and he gets in the car, and he says to me, really seriously, he goes, we got to get out of here right now. Get out now. And I look, and it was there were 50 kids before. Suddenly there's adults, and there must have been 200 people getting more. And if a kid had blocked the car, we had been in trouble because Wilt had a thing. And I always tell this story when I give talks, and you know what happens to me, Mark? I always end up crying or tearing up because it's probably going to happen to me now because I know this is how he felt. He wouldn't give an autograph unless he could give an autograph to everyone. If he couldn't give everyone an autograph, he didn't want to hurt. He didn't want some poor kid to think, well, why couldn't I get an autograph? And he because he knew clearly who he was to people. And there's still people to this day that say to me, oh, did I ever tell you I was at a custard stand up near Overbrook one day and Wilt was there? I'll never forget. So many people have these stories they'll never forget. But the point is, and here's the thing that's interesting about him, this is a little bit of a personal thing because as you can understand, I got to know him on a completely different level when he was living there. And it was just the two of us a lot of times. And I'll tell you two things. One was he used to listen to a show called The Marc of Jazz by a guy named Sid Marc, and it was WWDB. And what they used to do on that show is they would play a cut, and they'd have a guest on, a jazz aficionado, and that he'd have to go, oh, well, that was Sonny Rollins on this, and obviously it was so-and-so on the sax, and that was so-and-so on the drums. And Wilt knew them all, and he would guess them because he owned a nightclub. They would all be playing up there. By the way, Malcolm X was a waiter up there by the name of Detroit Red back in those days. So,
wow.
That's a whole other thing. But the thing is that when we were playing cards, he would lay down and I'd sit there, and I realized after a while it was different because you could actually talk to him. He was like face to face, and we could actually have a conversation, because if you were out with him or you were next to him, you didn't talk to him. You had to shout, hey, Wilt, what are we doing? He's so big. But here, and I really got to know him very, very well in these times. And in a certain regard, he was a freak of nature. And somebody once wrote, the first time I ever saw Wilt Chamberlin, the only other thing I can tell you that compares to it is the first time I ever saw the Empire State Building.
I got three more questions here, and I want you to try to keep your answers as concise as possible, just as we respect the clock, which continues to run here. Let's flash forward, of course. Wilt and the Sixers win the title in '67. Unfortunately, your dad did not see that because he ended up passing away before all that happened, at a game, no less, in Boston. And then in 1968, they're playing in the Spectrum. First year for that building. It goes to a Game 7 against the Celtics in the Eastern Finals. Wilt barely sees the ball in the second half, doesn't take a shot in the second half. What light can you shed on that?
None, because nobody understood what was happening, and it was like, what's going on? But it was death. That whole thing was, there was a Billy Cunningham once said, or more than once, that had Ike lived, that would have been a dynasty that would have ruled. But we thought that's where it was going, and it died. And nobody understood what happened. There are stories that came out later about why that is, but I wasn't privy to any of it.
Well, then after that was the Wilt trade. He goes to the Lakers, and I know you've been asked this question many times. I don't expect you to suddenly drop some news that's going to be a bombshell, but there was the understanding, at least according to one sports writer, that Wilt had an understanding with your father that he was going to get a piece of the team. Your father, as mentioned, passed away, and the other owner of the team, Irv Kozloff, was not about to honor that. What are your recollections of that story?
I never heard that story once until it appeared in I think it was Philadelphia Magazine. I never heard a thing about it. I knew nothing about it. I would tell you this, it would not surprise me in the least if they had a private deal. My father had no inkling that he wasn't going to make it through this, that he was going to die at this time, and that it would fall into the way that it was. But I have no input on that. Neither does my brother. I have an older brother, 8 years older, has some knowledge about this stuff. Never heard a thing about it. And Ted Kozloff, Irv's son, called me after that and asked me, "Do you know anything about this?" I said, "I don't." So.
And then, of course, every time I mention Wilt Chamberlain to somebody who has no idea who Wilt Chamberlain is, and they'll say, "Oh, he's the guy who slept with 20,000 women." Can you provide any context to that one?
Yeah. From my understanding, it was a joke. It was an I must have slept with 20,000 women. But I will tell you this, I was with him a lot during this particular season because I would drive him home, and when we would leave Convention Hall, there would always be sometimes two, sometimes five, sometimes more incredibly good looking ladies dressed to the nines, just there, like, hey, if you want it, I'm here. Every time he turned around, somebody wanted to go to bed with him. And I, a lot of times I'll give these book talks and I'll say, I have a book full of guys, and I'll say, I don't think there's anybody in this room that has 4 or 5 gorgeous women when they leave work that want to take them to bed. And always there's an accountant or a doctor who goes, yeah, that happens to me. So look, and he you have to understand, he was in his late 20s. He was the most eligible bachelor in the world, and he had to turn it away all the time. So how many women did he actually sleep with? Who knows? But you know something, and I'll tell you this, and I know this clearly, and we don't have time for me to tell you the story, but he told everybody clearly that this was a fling. It was not serious, and he was not getting married. That was out of the question. He was not a womanizer in the effect that he used women and threw them away and made promises. He was completely clear all the time. Don't get into this. I'm not getting married. You want to have fun? Fine. You want something more than that? We shouldn't do it.
The biggest takeaway from all your years knowing and living with and just being a friend of Wilt Chamberlain was what?
I'll tell you one very last story. In 1969, I was in San Francisco. Franklin Muley got me a job with the 49ers. I was in college. And Wilt invited me to come visit him in his new house in Los Angeles, and I did. And it was nice to see him in a home that was suited to him. It was pathetic when he lived at our house because he looked like he was in a dollhouse. Everything was tiny to him. Suddenly, I'm in this palace. It fits him, and we go out to breakfast. He wants to take me to this pancake place. We sit down at the table, and he puts two white envelope, big things wrapped up on the table, and I don't know what they are, and it says Caesar's Palace on them. They come out to give us the bill. He rips it open. There are 2 packs of $100 bills. There's $20,000 sitting on the table, and he rips it open and hands the 20. And she goes, "We go walking down the street to his car, and he's got both. He's got both of these things, and you can clearly see one of them is money." And we're walking down the street, and I said to him, "Will, what are you doing? Why, you're carrying that money?" He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "But somebody might want to steal it from you." And he just looks at me and goes, "They'd have to try to take it from me first." And when he said that, suddenly it was like, this guy has no self-doubt whatsoever. I never knew anybody that was on this plane where he knew who he was and he knew what he was there to do. And let me tell you something else. He was a private philanthropist. He gave a lot of money to a lot of people and would say, "Don't tell anybody." It was an incredible guy to see. And I also want to just add, because we didn't talk about my dad at all in this, but he was very, very close to my father. And when my father died, it was a tragedy. And how much more, are we done? Do we have, can I wrap this up?
You can wrap it up. Go ahead. You're good.
So the night my father died, it was in the Boston Garden. My father had made 2 pretty amazing moves. He got Billy Cunningham. He drafted him out of UNC. And Billy came to our house in Longport that summer. And apparently, Billy and my father got into an argument, and Billy was holding out for a couple of weeks, and they couldn't make the deal. And Mark, here's what the problem was: my father offered him 13 grand for the season, and Billy was holding out for 13.5. And that's where my father finally gave in and let him have it. Okay, so they got Billy, and then he got Wally Jones in this incredible deal that he made. Wally was missing; they didn't even know if he was alive. And my father put out these feelings, especially through Wilt's close friend Vince Miller. They found Wally. They got information to him. Wally showed up at the house. They took care of his legal problems. So they suddenly had this team of these 6 guys who became still thought of as one of the, in their day, the greatest team ever, and still looking back, one of the top probably 10 easy in the NBA. And they went to the Garden to play, and they were coming up. It was a big thing. It was the season that my father thought they were going to do it, and my father told them, "You're going to win this game in the Garden. We're going to win it." Okay. 13-13. My father was a very superstitious guy. The score's tied 13-13 in the Garden. He drops dead on the court. They carry him out. They don't know that he's dead, but they play the rest of the entire half. The first half is over. They go back to the locker room, and in the locker room at halftime, they tell him Mike died. So the story, it was told to me firsthand by somebody who was there in the Garden that night, said the team came out, and Wilt had a look on his face like he was red, like, don't come near me. And they blew the Celtics off the court. Each one of the 6 guys, every one of them was tight with my father. Each one of the 6 was in double figures. And Wilt played a game that was dominating. The guy who was there said, the Boston Garden, it sounded like they were playing in a parking garage. There was no sound at all. And at the end of the game, Wilt just took the ball and smashed it on the floor and stormed off. And according to the paper, he sat in front of his dressing room for 15 minutes with his head in his hands and didn't look up. And at the end, he made a very, very beautiful speech. And then he came to, the funeral. When it happened, there was like 2,500 people there. The mayor was there. The 76ers were all there. There was standing room only. Wilt and the team were standing against the door. And what was interesting was at that moment in that room, he wasn't Wilt Chamberlain anymore. He was crying. He was as sad as anybody else. And my father was only 52. It was a sudden death, like incredible. And a lot happened in the book, but they just had an incredible relationship that was really, really deep. And don't forget there were racial elements in those days too. It was when Wilt broke into the league, it wasn't that Jackie Robinson had just broken the color barrier in like 47 or whatever it is, and when the Warriors won the championship in '56, one black guy on the whole team in '56. So, and these guys had to navigate these waters. It was not easy,
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like, oh, Jewish guys are fine. The anti-Semitism, as bad as it may be now, it was. The Jews were not welcome people in those days. The Jews and the blacks were, in a thing together. And I'll tell you one other thing that I'll just mention this on behalf of my father, something that, because my father was an attorney and he represented all of these guys. And what happened was there was an unwritten law in the NBA. It was a rule. You don't put 5 black guys on the court at the same time. This is when things were building. And my father happened to be very good friends with Red Auerbach. They were in the same fraternity, not at the same college, but they were in the same fraternity. My father always referred to him as my brother Arnold. They used to smoke cigars together after the games at Convention Hall. And supposedly, and nobody can pin this down, but supposedly the 2 of them said, hey, you know what? The hell with the league and the hell with all of them. We're going to put 5 black guys on. And Red did it, and the Sixers did it. And that was the first time it ever happened. And it wasn't like, oh, ha ha. It was pretty bad. So, the times have changed. You can't even imagine what things were like in those days. It was very, very different. And later, my father was so known to be even-handed and good with the players and everybody, and the city as well as an attorney. One time, about 10 years ago, I got involved with this business, and we were stocking these books. We were opening these little bookstores in Christmas time, and we had hired these guys who they must have been in their 20s. And this one black guy who was a real nice kid, he was probably 26. He came up to me one day. He goes, "Was Ike Richman your father?" And I said, "Yeah, but how do you know that name? It's long, long ago that they had the 76ers." And he looked at me seriously and he goes, "Your father is still a legend in the black community." And I was like, "Wow, that came out of nowhere." So the times were different, whatever. Go ahead.
David, listen, the irony of podcasting is you can go longer than you normally would on most shows to do an interview. This was not nearly long enough, though I thank you for the time that you have given us. David Richman is our guest. The book is Wilt, Ike, and Me. David, thank you so much for being with us on Fresh 24.
Thank you, Mark. It was a real pleasure to see you.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode of Fresh 24. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Check out our friends over at Philadelphia Sports Nation, a local Philadelphia sports site covering your favorite teams across blogs and social media. PHLSportsNation.com. Philadelphia Sports Nation, PHL Sports Nation, enhancing your Philadelphia sports fan experience.